Jumps. Okie dokie artichokes. So today is June 10th on Monday. It's 2024, and this is the Security Collab Space weekly meeting. This is our first time running this meeting at 8:30 a.m. Pacific time rather than 11 a.m. Pacific after a very insightful calendar analysis exercise. And with that, we get to have Joe back and Marco. It's nice to see you here as well. Thanks for coming. So, agenda for today, and apologies for not having this written down ahead of time since I'm not doing super great, is Ulysses and I were talking last week, and I owe Ulysses something, so he's not going to be able to do everything that we planned on, but it'd be great, Ulysses, if you wouldn't mind talking about the cool scanner work that we were talking about. And also, another agenda item is to talk about the state of the compliance guidelines. So to
And Fred, just
start,
just so you know, I'm not sure if you're on chat or not, but I did create meeting notes for today, so I'll take notes and let me put the link in there again, just so you have it.
oh yes, awesome, thank you.
Yeah.
So with that, Ulysses, do you mind just kind of going over and showing folks what we were talking about last week?
Yep, yeah, we can go ahead. I have a small PR also that is now updated, but this is part of the discussion. So yeah, let me share my full desktop. Yeah, I have like a million Zoom pop-ups here, but you should be able to see GitHub, actually like a pull request.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, so basically the idea of this pull request, for those who are familiar with the scorecards, this might be familiar, especially Marco. I guess we use this a lot in the Node.js security working group to track all the repositories. So let me show you directly the report, so it's going to be easier.
Actually, Ulysses, let me give them some background to start.
Okay.
So my bad. The context of this is that as a part of the Sovereign Tech Fund work, and generally as a part of the security compliance guidelines work, it's great to write things down and build a checklist, but also it's important to be able to monitor these sorts of things. And so um, the intention of this is to use the scorecard infrastructure, um, which Ulysses is doing some awesome work on as well, so that even if an OpenJS maintainer has not deployed scorecard in their own projects to get the full scorecard experience and scans, there's a lot of things that scorecard that can scan for out without the maintainers having to do anything. And so the purpose of this is to make it so that we can have a dashboard of ongoing visibility into some of the controls that are in the guideline without any of the maintainers having to do anything. It's not going to be comprehensive, but it's kind of a gosh darn good start.
Yeah,
With that, Ulysses, thank you.
That's a super good intro. Thanks, Adam. Yeah, so basically the idea is, and also we have this challenge in the past, especially in the Node.js project. Basically, the idea was to try to adopt the scorecard. The problem with Node.js at the time was that we have like a lot of repositories that we want to track. And the problem is like, well, the scorecard is well designed for tracking a single repository. It's very hard to track like multiple repositories in one organization. So basically the idea at the time was to build like a monitor tool that basically for us, what is end up looking is something like this. In this case, you have more or less all the projects of the OpenJS Foundation. So you can see like every repository from every organization that we have in GitHub. This is a scan. Yeah, let me show you. The big piece of code here is this small GitHub action that they created time ago that it's has been donated to the OpenSSF. So officially, hopefully today, this will be like official tool from the OpenSSF. So that's why it's in draft because I need to change the GitHub action name and so on. But yeah, basically we are just tracking this organizations in GitHub. Anytime that any organization adds a new repository and so on, we try to query the scorecard for this, and we end up having this scoring. So the idea is like, as we do in Node.js, but this can be completely different for us, is we generate these tables. We have this database.json that is storing all the information and the changes for this scoring. So the idea is when you start to tracking these repositories, you normally want to do some changes. So let's see, for example, the Node.js project. Let me see. Well, there is a bunch of references for the Node.js organization. 1 second. Yeah, having just one screen today is a little bit tricky. But yeah, you have here the Node.js project, the Node.js project repository. So you can see here the reference of the last commit that has been indexed, the current scoring that you have. Here you have like a view, which is a different tool that we also donated to the OpenSSF and become an official tool, that you can actually review what is the current, the actual scoring for this specific commit, which is not something that you normally get in the other scoring tools. Also, you have the option to do comparisons. So the challenge here is like when you start to tracking the scoring, let's say like, for example, in Node.js, you have like 6.9 points, and you want to do some changes. First of all, if you are aware of step security, you can use this fix it kind of a fast button here, fast link, where you actually can auto-generate a PR for your repository directly from here. So you can already like create a PR or draft PR, so you can evaluate it, and you have a lot of out-of-the-box fix, like for example, pin dependencies, add dependable, these kind of things in a very simple click. So that's one option for us. And the other thing that we provide outside of the box is like when you run this scan again, let's say like in a couple of weeks or in 1 month or wherever we target to see the changes, you're going to see here in this column that is the deltas, the difference between the last execution and the current execution. So for example, you can see if you have increased or decreased from last execution, and you can see a different view of the report that highlights what has been different from one execution to another. We have been using this for almost a year or even a little bit more in the Node.js organization. And the idea was to try to bring this to the table here and see how we feel about it. Also, the option that I was talking with Adam was to try to define a scope, because obviously we are not going to monitor trillions and trillions of projects, and probably some of these are document related or archived or not relevant for us at all, right? So we have here this scope.json that is auto-generated. So every time that there is a new project added in one of these organizations, you will auto get it here. And we can just list the project that we are not comfortable with, so we can just exclude them. This is obviously going to be like a manual work that we can do once in a while. And the other option that we have been discussing is try to export this database in a format that is compatible with the CSV, peak level CSV that Adam is building as well. So we can integrate this information in a different dashboard if we don't want to consume this in these tables. And also the other option that we are exploring in the next step is to see how many of these reporting that we get here, how many of these repositories actually are tracked or not by the OpenSSF scorecard itself, because there are 2 ways to get your repo analyzed. One is like proactively. So in your repository, you create a GitHub action that, based on a criteria like every commit or something like that, you proactively send this information to them. Or the other option is to wait for a cron job that they have to just get the information from your repositories. This is, for example, how Node.js was tracked before the security team was involved in the initiative, right? The problem of having this kind of cron job automation is that you don't get some information about, for example, the branch protection, other stuff like you require the basic GitHub token. So that's why most of the people try to do that, but this requires an effort from the maintainer. So our idea also is to see which repositories are not listed here, so we can ask the OpenSSF to include them in the cron job at least. So even without any proactive effort from any maintainer, from any organization, we can start to track more repositories. But just taking account that we are going to have like lower scoring just because we are not proactively reporting, so we miss some points from the total scoring. Yeah, that was more or less, I think, an overview.
Can I
of
say one
this.
thing
Yeah,
quickly?
yeah, and
Just
million of them.
yeah, I mean, just congratulate you and thank you for your contributions to OpenSSF. It's been pretty cool to watch.
Thank you.
So amazing for context.
Thank you.
Ulysses, would you mind, talking about the scoring aspect of it? Would you mind talking about where scorecard is going with probes so we can kind of get
Yeah.
around the more emotional aspects of this?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, let me again. Well, we have here the Node.js. So yeah, basically, if you're familiar with the scorecard, there are certain proofs that we are doing per project. So normally we are looking, for example, for binary artifacts, obviously, that are there, so you can see if you get them or not. So for example, in the case of Node.js, which is maybe not for the rest of the JavaScript-based project in the organization, you can detect, like, for example, if you have a WebAssembly file or other kind of executable, these kind of things like branch protection, CI test, they're like an obvious things here. Other that are a little bit more tricky, for example, like fuzzing, which is something that are not super relevant for JavaScript. So Jordan is one of the people pushing back for this like mandatory proof. And the idea for the next version of the scorecard itself is to allow developers to include their own proofs here. So for example, you can develop your own things that are relevant for you or your organization. Let's say that, for example, that for your organization is super important to have a code of conduct included, even if it's not maybe a security thing, right? So maybe that's something that you can say. You can put a rule and say, like, I expect to have a code of conduct markdown file in the repository or a COC file in the repository of whatever criteria you have, and you can see if you meet or not those criteria. So that's going to be like a custom kind of things, but we can use these proofs to build our own kind of automation, so we can bring this scoring to much higher customization. Worth mentioning that even if we have this flexibility in the version 2 of the scorecard, which is currently in kind of development slash alpha, the idea here will be that we will still have like a generic regular scoring that will be based on the all existing proofs, right? But we can have as an organization our own more related proofs. So that way we can even customize and go deeper. And if we provide maybe extra permissions on the GitHub tokens and stuff like that, we can have rules like, do we have more than one administrator in the GitHub organization? Maybe something like it has the Linux Foundation users, like for example, Ben account is linked as administrator level for this organization. These kind of things we can have, this kind of proofs, obviously, for this. So this can be a good option for us. Worth mentioning that this code in Golang, so it's a good opportunity to save the skills in Golang if you are familiar with it. I'm hopefully get the opportunity to learn a little bit more. But yeah, that's one of the options that we can explore. If you're interested on this in more detail, I can try to find the documentation for the version 2, so you can get more idea. But that's the idea behind the custom proofs, that you can just actually go much deeper and customize.
Thanks, dude. I appreciate that. Any questions from folks? No? All right, great.
So I do have one quick question. You talked about, maybe I glossed over it, but you talked about adding your own custom like rules and rubrics. Can I turn off some of these default ones?
You can turn off some of the default ones in your own proofs, like the one that you're interested to run. So for example, let's say
Right.
you're not interested in fuzzing, you can say like, I don't want this one. And I have a different rules for me. Like for example, I have a S-lint, right? The thing is, even if you remove them from your custom way of consuming the scorecard as a tool, you are not
Right.
going to be able to remove them from the default proofs that they include as a scorecard product, let's say, right? So you will still need to discuss with them to get a fuzzing change at the what we understand as a global users the scorecard, right? It's going to be the same proofs as before, but now you have the option to run your own stuff with your own rules. So you
Cool.
can remove or add
Right.
whatever you want, but it's a
Thank you.
separate thing. Okay.
Yeah, it sounds like Ulysses. Like, I guess my sense was the intention of proofs was to be able to customize the checklist in general so that we could just say, like, just remove fuzzing entirely from
Yep.
the list. So is that true?
Yeah, that's going to be the expected. We need to explore this a little bit, but yeah, that's going to be the expected. Also, we will need probably to adapt this kind of tool like the visualizer and so on to see how much we can serve. But yeah, that's going to be probably the way to explore.
Gotcha. Cool. All right. So yeah, I'm really excited to hear about all of this. I think, it's when talking about security compliance guidelines, it's important to not just create a list of things to do, but also to be able to monitor and verify that folks are doing those things in the open
Yep.
source world without buying something like a whole bunch of um, auditing and monitoring tools and having an IT department which everybody else has, that's quite challenging. So this is a great first step towards that. Thank you very much for the demo, Ulysses.
Yeah, worth mentioning that on the same way as Adam just said, like, for example that we have in the past is like if you, for example, explain to all the maintainers of the project how important it is to have, like, let's say, branch protection enabled on your main branch, right? Maybe 6 months later, a new maintainer just removed this rule one day because whatever reason and forgot to turn it on or things like that, right? Because it's super hard to remember all of these rules. So by having this tracking over the time is super helpful for us. Also, another thing that you can detect, for example, is like code reviews. There are certain scenarios, for example, in Node.js where the code reviews doesn't apply. And in those cases, you get notified, right? So it's a good option also for us to say, like, look, there is something going green with one of the project or one of the repositories, so there is a behavioral change required and stuff like that. So it's very easy for us also to book and try to bring those specific teams and explain them, by asking for changes, or people, just change on the dependencies on the pipelines and the GitHub Actions, stuff like that, and don't ping the dependencies. This kind of things is super easy to track and also super easy to fix. But the most important thing for us, I think, as a small organization trying to have a control or understanding of what's going on and monitoring at the end, is like to be able to pull actions and to be able to track what's going on over the time, because people change on the project and these cultural things might be disappear or changing over the time. But yeah, that was like a fast summary.
Thanks so much, man. That was great. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Any other questions before we hop to the next item? All right, sweet jumps. Next on the list is the security compliance guidelines. Last week when we talked, it was on the agenda, and I appreciate. I want to just say thank you so much to Chris and Jordan for all of their feedback and inputs. If you haven't seen the Google Sheet or were following it, there was one night where I'm pretty sure like we were all just in the Google Sheet for a solid 5 hours commenting on like 70 rows back and forth. It was one of the most intense but productive and valuable Google Sheet comment driven document reviews I've ever done in my entire life. It was really fantastic. So first off, thank you, Chris and Jordan, for all the valuable inputs. The outcome of that was very interesting at the same time. So if you haven't read the introduction document to the guidelines yet, it's no longer the standard, but guidelines based upon feedback. Um, uh, uh, the intention of this set of guidelines is to be achievable. It is not aspirational, and thus it is nowhere near comprehensive. Instead, it is intended to be a list of things that are like, here's the things, if you're going to only do certain things, these are the things to really do. There's a lot of other ways to approach this, but given all the enormous amounts of prior art from like government and OpenSSF and CNCF and CIS and like literally everybody, I didn't really feel like for us it was appropriate to reinvent the wheel, but instead to distill all of that down to something that was manageable and genuinely actionable. And even then, the list is quite long, unfortunately. And I think that um, over time, not in this version one, but as we start actually rolling this out and seeing it used, there's an opportunity to just not distill it down further, but instead to help folks prioritize the activities within them. So rather than saying, here's the spreadsheet, it's only 70 rows, that's way better than everybody else, so have fun. Instead, it's here's the 70 rows, but if you only do one thing this week, this is the thing you should do first. And if you only do one thing next week, this is the thing you should do next. And so it's designed for that long term, for a long term focus on usability and consumability so that things actually happen. So with that, Chris and Jordan, I would really appreciate if you wouldn't mind kind of like providing, your thoughts on what you've seen so far, and in particular, some of the things that we talked about around provenance and attestation.
Yeah, no, thanks. So this, I mean, it's a really great list, and I love the cross-referencing to the other guides, some of which are imperfect, and I take partial responsibility for. I did mention to Rudd that some of these things we need to take back to as feedback to like the OpenSSF best practices guide because it's imperfect, and so definitely some good feedback in here that can help us improve the upstream guides that are being referenced or that are being referenced as well. But overall, I think it's really great. And yeah, our marathon commenting session, I think really led to some great refinements in here. I have not looked at this since that fateful night. I think we have a couple of outstanding comments still to resolve. It would be great, especially a couple of them. I think it's just me and Rudd. It'd be great to get another voice in there to kind of offer a third opinion, if you will. Obviously, Jordan is a good choice for that because he's been involved in many of the other comments, but also it would be great to get other folks to chime in there as well, or in general on the whole thing, although it can be a bit daunting. But overall, I think it's in really great shape. And then you mentioned the attestation. Yeah, so the one thing that's, like I said, I haven't looked at this since that night. But the only thing that I can recall about attestation was the one that gives, like, the provenance that it gives is effectively it's nothing. It's like it shows that it was signed, and you can go to like the GitHub repo and evaluate that the software is meets your expectations or not, and it's essentially like a big nothing. It's like a rubber stamp that signifies like absolutely nothing. Like it basically adds no value, so you're going through this trouble to like sign something for basically zero added benefit, absolutely no impact on security. And because of that, I think it would be a mistake to recommend or ask projects to do it. Bye, Joe. Yeah, so that's the one I recall. I'm not sure if there's another one I'm forgetting.
Yeah, Chris, I think there was a larger discussion about how, like, philosophically, the intent was to put these ideas of provenance and attestation into this, even if they're just recommended and not expected. But it just really seemed from our conversation that this stuff isn't really quite there yet, in particular because most OpenJS projects are publishing locally rather than doing that through formal CI, which seems to be like like a foundational assumption of a lot of this provenance and attestation stuff. Is that a fair statement?
I think that's a fair statement. That I think we're also mixing up two things. One is the publication and what can be done in terms of like the like automated salsa provenance, and then that's slightly different than another item that I cannot recall. But yeah, so part of this is like an ecosystem limitation where you cannot deploy without, you cannot automate your deployment with multi-factor authentication, which is like a long-standing pain point. And so because of that, you cannot do the automated GitHub action that generates like your build system provenance or an attestation that would kind of check that box and be able to do more and say like, yes, we verified that. And in that case, it would not be have built from locally. It would have been built within the GitHub, GitHub runners and sort of closed ecosystem. And you have an isolation, and you can, if you trust that anyway, there's always this question of, okay, this this attests that the system was closed, but you're also trusting GitHub that is actually true. But aside from that aspect, that would enable you to do that. It's just that then you have to do you only have single factor authentication. And that's kind of it's a big pain point.
I think my overall thoughts are, I talked to Rudd a little bit to confirm what the audience is for this spreadsheet. And I think if we are trying to, for somebody who is familiar with the kind of hype train in the security community and OpenSSF's very long list of suggestions and so on, this spreadsheet is perfect. Because it point by point includes all the things that they will be curious about. And I think that's a good thing. This is very much not ready for maintainers, but that's not the intention yet, right? This is just like a first step. So that's great. I think that I think that a recommendation to open source maintainers is inherently costly and must not be made unless it provides sufficient positive value. So that includes like if it's neutral, we still shouldn't ask people to do it because it doesn't help enough and override that cost. And there is a lot of the things in this list that in the conceptual list, not necessarily the specific things on the spreadsheet, but where they don't actually add concrete value. They add theoretical value. And that isn't valueless, but that is a much harder ask and justification for maintainers who are paid nothing to do this stuff. So I think that some of these things are going to be, well, this is a general purpose recommendation that's not appropriate for JavaScript. Those aren't going to be a hard argument with anyone because they're like, yeah, fair enough. But then there's some of the things where it's like, but in theory, this whole thing is very important. This is an attack vector, but if no one's ever actually exploited it and no one's trying to exploit it, and the mitigations and detections, if someone did exploit it, are already pretty prevalent, then like there's not a lot of value in adding complexity to prevent that particular attack vector. The attack vector that has been almost exclusively exploited is a rogue maintainer, and it's hard for me to feel motivated to solve anything except that problem. And so anything that's attestations is you immediately can't trust the maintainer. And that includes account takeovers, right? Because if they take over the account, they are the person effectively. So I think that's been a lot of my comments have been in that vein. And I think, so yeah, so I think that as we eventually move from this spreadsheet to trying to refine that into a solid public position and recommendation to the open source ecosystem and project maintainers, we're going to have to very carefully evaluate the cost benefit and the concreteness of the value of the recommendation. But this is great work, Rudd. It's a lot of research, and yeah, I hope the rest of you also can find time to look over it if you haven't yet. More voices are great.
So thank you, Jordan, for that. So I'm just thinking a little bit about like the path forward, right? Of like you know, how does this become something that's actually actionable and used, right? So just correct me if any of this is wrong, but the next step on this is at some point or figuring out like what is the actual list of things that we want to require, like that the things that are actually providing value that aren't theoretical, like to address Jordan's comments. And then, you know, of course, having these like tiers of like this is, you know, if you want to do above and beyond what like the minimum that we think you need. Yes, Chris.
I didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh, okay. And then like where I'm seeing this go forward is that then there's like an audit of our projects to see sort of like, you know, which ones have that minimalist, which ones don't, and making this a requirement for new projects that come in, right? As part of our like checklist when we onboard projects, like we'll have a security checklist that will include those required items. Is that consistent with folks' understanding?
That makes a lot of sense to me. Your question in terms of next steps, I think this is in really good shape. I think this is actionable now. Most of these things are not aspirational, and they can be, and many of them are very, you know, some of these things are like, you know, flip a bit. Other things are a little bit more involved. But you know, once this is in a little bit more of a consumable format, you know, whether that's a markdown file or what have you, um, I think a lot of these things, especially in the expected category, um, are things that can be, in many cases, there are things like if a project maintainer is looking at this and going through this, a lot of these things, probably they can already just check off, say, oh, already doing this, already doing that. And then the other things, you know, the things that are easier to do and not, you know, controversial in any way, although most of this really shouldn't be, are things they can easily enable. And so it'd be great to sort of get uh, projects to sort of um, go through the exercise and see what they can check off and what gaps remain. Like it's like we can use our imaginations on what you know, how much of this can be um, you know, accomplished easily by a project, but until a project actually starts going through it, that's going to inform with real data. Um, and then that will give you a sense of like, okay, where are we at with this and how reasonable would it be to actually make it a requirement of any sort of like, if you're making it a requirement for like incubating project, a new incubating project to reach that stage, you know, how reasonable that expectation would be. So that I think would come a little bit later once you've sort of really tested this against existing projects and worked out any sort of kinks or any kind of, there's also some things that are kind of conditional, like, well, you know, for this one, you know, if your project is of this nature or if this thing holds true, then it makes sense to have this. You don't want to have a ton of that because it, you know, adds complexity in terms of like how much you need to think about something and do the assessment, but there is a little bit of that. So again, just seeing how that shakes out when a project goes to start checking the stuff off of the list, it's going to help inform that a lot.
Yeah, so I really appreciate Jordan's input on this because Jordan represents a really important voice. And I think also at the same time we have not had enough voices to be able to give more holistic perspectives on it. So I would appreciate a couple more eyes on this so that we can come to a consensus on some things. I do agree that so in the initial version that Jordan and Chris reviewed, I did intentionally put some things out there that were kind of like me feeling it out and let's see how the feedback goes. And pretty much all the things that I did that for wound up getting pulled out. The entire provenance and attestation concept and section no longer exists for one thing, just to give an example, because that covered S bombs, that covered salsa files, and all of the stuff that there's a lot of focus on. But when we actually work through the details of like, well, what is this actually giving us? And it's very clear, at least in the context of folks publishing to NPM, that it just was not, like the juice wasn't worth the squeeze. That's not to say that one day it will not be. I hope that it will be, but there are some significant gaps today. And Jordan and I, when we chatted one-on-one, are going to be capturing those gaps so that they're written down and we can more effectively communicate those broadly, and also to help folks understand why they're not there. Because I think it's reason. I think given the emphasis on these concepts in across the domain right now, it's reasonable for us to write down the rationale and discussion on why they ultimately were not included. Are there some things? I think there are some things in there that are best practices rather than like absolutely must-haves, but those are also, there's also room for negotiation on those. So yeah, I think if folks have time to go look into the sheet in more depth, please go look at the intro doc first just to get yourself calibrated in a little bit more detail to the whys and wherefores of what's going on in it. But yeah, it'd be great to have some other perspectives so that we can really come to like a solid, like, you know, we're never going to agree on everything, but at least we can say like, you know what, for what we're trying to do, this is good enough for us to be able to lock for a V1. So then I can start working on the formatting aspects of this and consumability aspects of it. But I think also importantly, to Jordan's point, and I think Jordan was really the reason for this idea I mentioned earlier, is to make sure that as we started seeing folks test and try to use this, we can help prioritize the things to do, not necessarily in like, maybe even like in a serial order, like, you know, from 1 to 70, this is the order you should do them in from a security value and risk management perspective, or something like that. So that it isn't just one long list of 70 things, and which is overwhelming to anybody, including being a security guy living this my entire career. So yeah, I think that's where we are for next steps. But I think
Hey,
I'll go ahead, Robin.
Can I just interrupt? And I know Chris, I think, has his hand up. I think when we roll this out, it would maybe be nice to have a stack ranking on what is a priority, as sort of been mentioned. And then right out the gate, we should explain what's not in there and why right out the gate, because people are looking to us, our stakeholders, our security stakeholders, our funders on some of these issues, policymakers. So I would love to get to a point if, you know, this is an amazing piece of work, but let's prioritize how we roll it out. You know, boom, 1, 2, 3, the most important things we need to explain and hit on. And then Chris, you want to jump?
Yeah, no, 100% agree. I'll come back to that because I have a couple of things I want to touch on. And this is something that came up repeatedly in when we were going through the spreadsheet and commenting on items and some of the things that got removed, and that is that things that we are not including in the guidelines should not be omitted entirely. They should be there. And this is something also that I've noted on some of the OpenSSF guides is like, this guide doesn't talk at all about this thing, which makes us like it needs to be added, right? Even if you're not providing guidance on something for whatever reason, it shouldn't just be, you know, very conspicuously missing from the guide. So 100% that should be part of it, and whether that takes the shape of like, you know, a FAQ or whatever, you know, we could work that out. So that's super important. One thing I wanted to mention on the SBOMs is, you know, a huge part of it is like, what are they looking for? You don't, you know, whoever's wanting the SBOM or looking for the SBOM, you know, aside from there being like 5-10 different types of SBOMs, you have to understand what like the person interested or the entity interested in the SBOM, what in particular are they trying to glean from it? What information do they want out of that? This came up in the jQuery infrastructure channel, I think last week, and it perfectly illustrated the problem. And that is, we got asked for an SBOM, jQuery project got asked for an SBOM. It's like, okay, well, what are they interested in? What are they trying to get from the SBOM? And, you know, especially for libraries, which I think most of the OpenJS projects are libraries. There's very few in the way of like end user applications in OpenJS projects. And an SBOM for a library is fairly useless in and of itself. And not just that, it gives a false representation of what dependencies are actually in a consuming application. So whoever is asking for like the jQuery SBOM, they really, you know, I don't know what they're looking for, but they most like 99.9% likelihood is that they're not looking for a jQuery SBOM. Even though jQuery doesn't actually have any dependencies, are they looking for, you know, a build SBOM? They're probably looking for an application SBOM. And so a library, a more sort of, I'll say more common library that doesn't apply to jQuery that actually has some dependencies. You don't want the SBOM generated in isolation for that library. You want an SBOM generated for your application or whatever's consuming that library, because that's going to tell you what dependencies are actually running. And so, you know, yeah, so again, like these are things that are important to include in the guide, and not just not have anything in there about SBOMs, but really sort of dig into this and provide this information so that whoever is interested in that understands the limitations and requirements and how you generate SBOMs and what types of SBOMs there are, so that they can make an informed decision with what they're actually trying to do. Because blindly saying, here's an SBOM for the thing, isn't really helping anyone, even if you can generate it easily, which you can. And the last thing I wanted to mention was on the organization of the items. So, you know, RUD has these, you know, thoroughly mapped to sections, you know, source control, code review, dependency inventory, which I think is really good. But I agree that it would be great to order the things by impact and like what, like if you do nothing else, like what's number one, and if you do nothing else besides that, what's number two? And I think that's super important. Yeah, I'll stop there. I think Jordan had, yeah, turn on multi-factor authentication, although I think that's required now pretty much.
Yeah,
Maybe
you
not
basically
across
can't
the
have it
board.
off on GitHub and NPM at this point. So
Yeah, so
you know,
I don't know
if you
about
have a
GitLab
project that matters.
Yeah, we can take a look at what GitLab requires too.
Well,
But
and I was just going to say, like, I think there's a lot of feedback, helpful feedback we can give to the scorecard project, to all sorts of parts of the OpenSSF, to the piles of stakeholders Robin was referring to. The struggle, I think, is that I suspect we won't be giving them any new feedback. We just will be giving it with some credibility of the foundation behind it, which may be helpful, but like this is information they already have. So like Chris was talking about SBOMs, like I know that's a whole thing we've talked about, but like realistically in security, you shouldn't trust anything anyone claims. You should be able to verify those claims. And so that's why a generated SBOM isn't super useful unless it's like, you know, in many cases. What is useful though is being able to programmatically generate your own, and for the library author, let's say, making sure it's easy for you to do that. And there's probably like a shift in perspective that would be really helpful for the OpenSSF or the SBOM folks or whatever to consider. And like that's the kind of thing that I hope that we can come up with as like, so that we can achieve the security intentions and goals without necessarily yeah, it's just in a way that's meaningful. Yeah, and as Matt is mentioning in chat, right, like the information that like is ephemeral is very valuable to document. So like
Yeah,
while
so I
you're
mean,
doing a build, like
I
the
feel like
stuff in
I
your,
got to chime in now. Can I chime in? Is available? Am I
yeah,
ahead of-
please. Yeah.
So no, you're absolutely spot on. I mean, we just need to teach people to use bills and materials and give them the tools to create them. But you know, it's always been for me for the last 3 years in IBM and out is to get that manufacturing information. It's colloquially known as manufacturing BOM. That should be part of the artifact BOM, which is the CISA term, which includes all your CI/CD tools and your build process and your whoever touched that, whoever kicked off the build and whoever touched the build or parts of it. all those things are that gives you the most meaningful BOM. And of course, I've said you can go further. You can actually do a deployed BOM or a runtime BOM, but the tooling is typically not accessible to people out there. But it is achievable, you know, with GitLab, GitHub, and using some of the processes. You know, like Chris said, you've got to trust GitHub to build your stuff sometimes, but there you can create your own runners. You can create your own CI runners. You can eventually you can transition from GitHub building it to I'm building it on my systems, and you can still bring all your tool set with you if you want to, and you can improve it. Then you can actually start adding like GPG signing and other things that are, and you can say, here's where I manufacture it. And you can actually attest to the fact that I built it on this, you know, virtual private computing cluster that I have, you know, and here are the only people who have access to it. So, you know, you could do these things eventually, right?
So
Yeah,
that's
good.
no, it's funny you mentioned the self-hosted runners because we actually say to not use those in the guide.
Yeah, so I'm saying, but the thing, you can move to those things. That's what we did at Apache Foundation, right? So
Sure.
eventually,
Yeah, but
I'll just
you open up, you open yourself up now. You've got to manage the security
no,
for all of that stuff as well.
yeah,
So
my point is, and is not, I applaud everything that I've heard. I am thrilled, and I don't want to add my voice because it sounds like everyone's been very involved working on this stuff, and you come out, you're kicking out all the right answers and the right priorities and all those things. And I just want to congratulate and applaud everybody and thank you, because I think what you're giving me is a curated set of documents, a playbook, if you will, a pattern, if you will, that other foundations will want to use. I am looking forward to seeing if this can be applied to the Python ecosystem, basically. That's what I'm looking forward to. And again, security is never perfect. As long as you can, you know, as I've said this before, as long as you know, if I need to add another hurdle or obstacle or another wall for an attacker to get around, what's next thing on my checklist? And, you know, and making that implementation, that checklist item as easy as possible. That's all it is.
Matt, I had a question. You had referenced a couple times two types of bombs that I did not recognize. One was artifact, and I forgot the other one you mentioned.
Yeah,
Are those new terms, or do they map to the
I can give
SBOM
my
types?
presentation I gave inside IBM on a blueprint talk last month. I can probably bring it up and show a guide, but the problem is CISA defines 6 bomb types. So I often refer to them in general settings, but the problem is that artifact bomb doesn't capture what Jordan was saying, is like, you really want the CI/CD manufacturing information. So most people in the industries ask for manufacturing bombs, M bombs. And that's the portion I designed for Cyclone. So
what is
CISO looked at things from where do I generate these things in a CI pipeline? And they name them according to different phases, generalized phases of how you build software and pump it out, a life cycle of the software. But they didn't, I think that when you start talking about SBOMs, you're going to be talking more about the data that's in them, what's included and not included. Is it manufacturing, the CI/CD data, the workflows, the tasks, the steps, even down to the commands and the events. And also for crypto, for quantum safe crypto, everyone's got to switch to in the next 2 years. You want the crypto information there. If people start adding AI, they want the ML data. So they're called ML bombs and C bombs for crypto and M bombs for manufacturing. And then I think there's a manufacturing bomb is better known as B bomb or build bomb in the Linux Foundation world, the SPDX world. So everyone has different bomb types. What it comes down to is we need, you know, and we've lacked good leadership on this, unfortunately, at CISA, that we need bombs that better describe what goes into what information is meaningful, more like a salsa thing, more like a, you know, for a trust, you need a trust level. And BOM is the index into what you've done to instill trust in your build process. And that's what the BOM should be referenced by, but no one's properly doing that. So it's groups like this that are making the real decisions, and you decide what semantics you want to use, but it boils down to, if you create a BOM, what information, you know, do you expect at what levels, right? So.
Yeah, I know we're at time, but as a brief response to that, Matt, I think one of the takeaways from the conversation on this exact topic, and recognizing that the real value of these bombs, I won't even say S bomb at this point, is that CI/CD information. Um, the fact is, most of these projects, because of the lack of two-factor in GitHub Actions, are building locally. So I think one of the things, Robin, just as a heads up that I think was my enormous takeaway from this is that is a question on whether or not it makes sense for OpenJS to build a little bit of infrastructure so that we can put that so that projects can have that two-factor functionality available to them in GitHub Actions, and thus they can begin to transition from publishing locally to publishing in in a GitHub runner, which would, I think, realistically be the first thing to do before we ask folks to spend a lot of time on how
Well,
they do this stuff.
if I might comment in the
Well,
last 2 minutes, it's actually kind of interesting because if you followed me, I've been switched to the AI space, and provenance is paramount in AI space, where the project I was on is basically having people crowdsource models. So where is the data that's being put in the models coming from? Provenance is ultra important. So day one, we had to, for the first UI we put together to support the project, we had to incorporate OpenID and primarily GitHub, so that when anybody contributes data to a model, we have their provenance. So, enabling that from day one in AI projects is paramount. So, for code, I think that's a model that we should look to facilitate and help people with. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we have one raised hand, so I think, Chris, this will be final closing thoughts. Or rather, last comment before we run out of time.
Oh, I would just, I had recalled earlier when I was talking about publishing from automation and not having multi-factor authentication that I think Jordan kind of shook his head for a second. Was there something new possible that I'm unaware of? Or?
No, I was just gonna say that it's frustrating that basically the primary thing that the entire world would need to do this elegantly is for GitHub to natively add the ability for an action to pause and wait for user input. If that happens, then 99% of my desire to publish locally would be gone. But we can't make Microsoft do anything.
Have we made a formal request from a foundation perspective to do
Good
that?
question. I don't know.
We could do that.
Yeah, that would be great. There's
Jordan and I did agree to create a list
Robin.
of all the things that are needed. So he's promised to, given all of his extensive inputs, he's promised to help me document all of these in an actionable way. Chris?
I mean, if you can do that, that would enable like a number of things, and that would enable
large number of
also
things.
including a meaningful provenance for node packages. So like it's like a multifaceted benefit, and the whole world has been waiting for this. It's not like there's some niche, like we're some niche.
An alternative angle, which is also
Every-
valuable, is staged NPM publishes. If either of those existed, we'd have the ability to generate the artifacts in a secure place and then have a human involved in promoting them. And that would be wonderful.
Any workflow mechanism, a manual callback is always for a legal sign off, or a person to sign off, or to whatever, has been the holy grail. And if GitHub can do that, and that's even in Tecton, people have asked for that, right? Manual tasks, manual callbacks, right? Subscription model.
It shall be documented.
I have to drop. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Hey, everybody. Great. Thanks, Ulysses, for the demo. Chris, Jordan, thanks again for all the awesome inputs. Matt, always appreciate you being here and providing that perspective, because it is a valuable, important one for us to remember and keep in mind throughout all of this. And I'm glad that you're getting value out of this as well. So let's go get GitHub and NPM to do what we need to do so that we can actually do all the things that you're saying we should be doing. So happy Monday, folks. And also thank you very much for the earlier time. It does make my life a lot easier in the day-to-day. So greatly appreciate that. So
Thanks, everyone.
with that, toodles.
Mhm.